Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Beatrice Sterling laughed as she poured the vintage Bordeaux over Elena Sterling's cream-colored silk in front of the entire charity gala board. The deep red liquid bloomed across Elena's chest like a fresh wound, the cold moisture seeping through the expensive fabric to chill her skin. The boardroom, a temple of polished mahogany and the cloying scent of white lilies, fell into a suffocating silence. Beatrice set the crystal glass down with a delicate clink, her diamonds catching the light of the chandelier. "Oh, Elena, I'm so sorry. I suppose I'm just not used to seeing someone so out of place at a table like this. My hand must have slipped." The 5 board members shifted in their leather chairs, their eyes darting from the matriarch of the Sterling Empire to the woman who had married into it. No one spoke. In this room, Beatrice's word was law and her cruelty was a spectator sport. Julian Sterling stepped forward, his face a mask of conflicted horror. He reached for a linen napkin, his hand trembling slightly. "Mother, that was unnecessary. Elena, let me help you." "Sit down, Julian," Beatrice snapped, her voice like a whip. She didn't even look at her son. Her gaze remained fixed on Elena, her lips curled in a triumphant smirk. "She can handle it. After all, she's used to messes, isn't she? I hear the neighborhood she grew up in was full of them." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the napkin, and she didn't offer a tearful apology for existing. She simply sat there, the wine dripping from the hem of her dress onto the marble floor with a rhythmic tap, tap, tap. She could feel the heat of the humiliation Beatrice intended for her, but beneath it, a different kind of fire was beginning to burn. "Is that all, Beatrice?" Elena asked, her voice calm and level. The matriarch's eyes narrowed. She had expected a scene, a breakdown, or at the very least, a hasty retreat. "It's enough for now. You're dismissed. Go find something to wear that doesn't cost more than your father's life insurance policy. It's clearly wasted on you." Clara Sterling, sitting at the far end of the table, let out a sharp, jagged breath. The rebellious daughter of the family looked as though she wanted to scream, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. But even she stayed silent. The Sterling legacy was a cage, and Beatrice held the only key. Elena stood up. The silk dress clung to her legs, heavy and ruined. She looked at the board members, men and women who had watched her be dismantled for sport, and she saw the pity in their eyes. She didn't want it. As she turned to leave, her hand brushed against the small, inconspicuous flash drive hidden in the velvet lining of her clutch. It was a cold, hard weight that felt more real than the diamonds Beatrice wore like armor. She had spent months as the quiet observer, the charity case, bride who was seen but never heard. In that time, she had seen things the Sterlings thought were buried under decades of prestige. She walked toward the heavy oak doors, the sound of her own heels echoing against the marble. Just as she reached the exit, she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "You're right about one thing, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I am used to messes, and I've learned that the bigger they are, the harder they are to sweep under the rug." Beatrice's smirk flickered. "Are you threatening me, dear? You don't have the currency." "I have more than you think," Elena replied softly. She stepped out into the hallway, the scent of lilies replaced by the sterile, cold air of the corridor. Standing in the shadows near the elevator was Sila's Thorn. The old family employee, a man who had served the Sterlings since before Elena was born, didn't say a word. He simply handed her a heavy, tan envelope. "Is it all there, Sila's?" she whispered. The old man nodded, his eyes full of a weary, ancient justice. "Everything, Elena. The blueprints, the offshore accounts, and the original deed to the Sterling estate. She never thought anyone would look in the foundation." Elena felt the weight of the envelope in her hand. It was the key to the cage. For years, Beatrice had treated the Sterling name as a weapon, using it to bruise and break anyone who didn't fit her vision of perfection. She had forgotten that even the tallest towers were built on dirt. 3 days, Elena murmured, more to herself than to Sila's. "The anniversary gala," Sila's confirmed. "The whole city will be watching." Elena looked down at the wine stain on her dress. It was a mark of shame in Beatrice's eyes, a brand of the outsider. To Elena, it was the last time she would ever allow herself to be the victim of a Sterling's whim. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to slide shut, she saw Julian emerge from the boardroom, his face etched with a guilt he wasn't brave enough to act on. He called her name, but she didn't answer. The descent was smooth, the numbers on the display ticking down. With every floor, the woman who had entered the building as a sleeping lion felt herself waking up. Beatrice Sterling thought she had just ruined a dress. She had no idea she had just started a war. Elena walked out of the Sterling Tower and into the bright, unforgiving light of the afternoon. She didn't call a car. She didn't hide. She walked down the street with the red stain blooming on her chest, a scarlet letter that she would soon turn into a banner of victory. She pulled her phone from her purse and dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. "Detective Miller," she said when the line connected. "It's Elena. I have the documents Sila's mentioned. We need to talk before the gala." She hung up and looked at the towering glass structure behind her. The Sterlings were proud of their reflection, but Elena knew the glass was thin, and she was finally ready to throw the first stone. The next morning, the sun struggled to pierce a thick, charcoal-colored fog that had settled over the city. Elena sat in the back corner of a quiet university library, far from the polished marble and judgmental whispers of the Sterling social circle. The air here smelled of vanilla rot and ancient dust, a grounding contrast to the expensive, suffocating lilies that always filled Beatrice's home. Her chest still felt tight, a phantom pressure lingering where the red wine had soaked into her skin the day before. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the sound of Beatrice's laughter, that sharp, entitled bark of a woman who believed she was untouchable. Sila's Thorn arrived 10 minutes late, his shoulders hunched as if he expected a blow from the shadows. He looked older than he had when he'd been the Sterling's lead surveyor, his face a map of deep-set regrets. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he slid a weathered leather satchel across the scarred oak table. His hands, stained with the ink of a lifetime of silence, trembled. "You shouldn't have called me, Elena," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried over the rhythmic ticking of a nearby grandfather clock. "If Beatrice Sterling finds out I'm talking to you, she'll ensure my pension vanishes before the sun sets. She's already been asking questions about who you've been seen with." Elena didn't flinch. She reached out and touched the cool, cracked leather of the satchel. "She's already taken everything she can from me, Silas. Now she's just playing with the ashes." Her phone vibrated against the table, the harsh buzz cutting through the silence. It was a message from Julian. "Elena, Mother is beyond furious. She's already had the locks changed at the penthouse and sent your things to a local shelter. She says you're unstable and dangerous. Just apologize, please. I can fix this if you just stop being so difficult." The cowardice in his words felt like a physical weight. He wasn't asking if she had a place to sleep. He was asking her to be quiet so his dinner parties wouldn't be awkward. Elena felt a cold, sharp clarity settle in her bones. The golden sun was nothing more than a gilded cage for his mother's lies. She ignored the message and opened the satchel. Inside lay a series of architectural blueprints, the vellum yellowed and brittle. She pulled one out, the paper crinkling loudly in the hushed room. As she smoothed it over the table, the intricate lines of a grand estate emerged, Blackwood. It was the project that had put Sterling architecture on the map 20 years ago, the foundation of their entire empire. But as Elena's eyes moved to the signature block in the corner, her breath hitched. The name wasn't Sterling. It was her father's elegant, sloping script. "She didn't just take the designs, did she?" Elena asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. Silas leaned in, the scent of peppermint and stale tobacco clinging to him. "She waited until the day after your father's funeral to file the patent under her own name. She told the board he was a drunk who couldn't finish a single sketch. She said she saved the firm by finishing his work. I was the only one who saw the original drafts, and she bought my silence with a house I can never truly own." The betrayal was visceral, a bitter taste like copper on the back of her tongue. Beatrice hadn't just stolen a legacy. She had dismantled a dead man's honor to build her throne. Elena traced the lines of the Blackwood blueprints, her mind already deconstructing the Sterling Empire floor by floor. She wasn't just an architect of buildings anymore. She was the architect of a reckoning. "The gala is in 3 days," Elena said, her gaze fixed on the stolen signature. "Beatrice thinks she's celebrating the anniversary of the Sterling legacy. She has no idea she's actually hosting its funeral." Silas watched her, a flicker of something like hope, or perhaps terror crossing his face. "What are you going to do?" Elena stood up, the weight of the satchel feeling like a shield against her hip. "I'm going to show the world what happens when you build a house on a foundation of ghosts." She walked out of the library and into the biting chill of the morning. As she reached the curb, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up, blocking her path. The back door swung open, and for a heartbeat, Elena's hand tightened on the satchel. But it wasn't a threat that stepped out. It was Clara, her eyes red-rimmed but her jaw set with a familiar, Sterling defiance. "Get in," Clara said, her voice shaking. "She's calling a board meeting for tomorrow morning. She's going to have you legally barred from the estate." Elena stepped into the car, the scent of Clara's expensive perfume clashing with the grit of the city. The countdown had begun. 3 days. 3 days until the ghosts of Blackwood finally came home to stay. 2 hours later, the rain had turned into a persistent, icy drizzle that blurred the neon signs of the city into smears of light. Elena sat in the dim corner of a secluded studio Clara kept in the industrial district, the air smelling of linseed oil and the sharp, metallic tang of cold radiators. She spread the contents of the leather satchel across a scarred drafting table. Her fingers, numb from the morning chill, traced the embossed seal on a series of offshore bank statements. It was the anatomy of a theft, a paper trail that led directly from the Sterling family trust into accounts Beatrice had hidden for decades. Clara paced the perimeter of the room, her designer heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm against the concrete floor. She kept glancing at her phone, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. "She's already moved," Clara said, her voice brittle with a mix of fear and residual adrenaline. "The notification went out to the board 10 minutes ago. Beatrice isn't just barring you from the estate, Elena. She's filed an emergency injunction. She's claiming you're mentally unstable and that you've stolen irreplaceable family artifacts to fund a vendetta." Elena didn't look up. She was focused on a ledger from 30 years ago, its pages yellowed and smelling of damp basement air. Let her claim whatever she wants. The louder she screams now, the more deafening the silence will be when the truth hits the table. The heavy steel door at the back of the studio groaned on its hinges. Silas Thorne stepped inside, shaking a wet umbrella. He looked older in the dim light, his shoulders stooped under a heavy wool coat that smelled of wet sheep and tobacco. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he walked to the table and placed a single, translucent blueprint over the documents Elena was studying. "The Blackwood estate was never meant to be a home," Silas murmured, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. He pointed to a structural anomaly in the foundation of the west wing. It was a shell company made of stone and mortar. Your father-in-law used the construction to wash the money from the union scandals, and Beatrice was the one who signed the checks. When the lead architect threatened to go to the authorities, he disappeared. They called it a site accident, but these records prove the safety inspections were forged. Elena felt a cold shiver of realization settle in her marrow. This wasn't just about a stolen inheritance or a bitter mother-in-law. It was about a legacy built on blood and silence. She touched the corner of the blueprint, the paper feeling unnaturally smooth, like a shroud. This was the weapon she had been looking for. Her phone vibrated on the table, the screen illuminating Beatrice's name. Elena hesitated, then swiped to accept the video call. Beatrice appeared on the screen, looking radiant and utterly composed. She was sitting in the high-backed velvet chair of the library Elena had just fled, a crystal flute of vintage champagne in her hand. In the background, Julian moved past a doorway, his face a mask of weary indifference as he avoided the camera's lens. The sight of him, so easily manipulated back into his mother's orbit, sent a fresh spike of ice through Elena's chest. "I hope you're enjoying your little hideout, Elena," Beatrice sneered, her voice smooth and dripping with mock sympathy. "I've had the security team clear out your suite. It was quite cathartic, really. Your clothes are currently sitting in industrial garbage bags on the curb. I told the staff to be careful with the knockoffs, though I doubt the rain will do them much favors." Beatrice leaned closer to the camera, her diamond earrings catching the light with a predatory glint. "The board meeting is at 9 tomorrow morning. Don't bother showing up. I've already authorized the gate guards to use force if you attempt to trespass. You were a temporary lapse in judgment for this family, a smudge on the Sterling name that I am finally scrubbing away. You never belonged in our world, and by noon tomorrow, the world will finally agree with me." She ended the call with a sharp flick of her finger, leaving the studio in a sudden, heavy silence. "She's so sure of herself," Clara whispered, staring at the dead screen. "She thinks she's already won." "Arrogance is a blindfold," Elena said, her voice calm and dangerously low. She turned to Sila's, her eyes reflecting the cold light of the drafting table. "Can the auditor verify these forged inspections by morning?" Sila's nodded slowly. "He's been looking for a reason to settle this debt for 20 years. He'll have the certified copies ready by dawn." Elena looked at the clock on the wall. 18 hours. The countdown had moved from days to hours, and the weight of the satchel no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a detonator. She reached out and touched a small, silver recorder she had kept hidden in her palm during the call. She hit play, listening to Beatrice's voice brag about disposing of her belongings. "She thinks she's scrubbing a smudge," Elena said, her gaze fixed on the blueprint of the house of cards Beatrice called a home. "She doesn't realize she's just given me the final piece of the puzzle." She stood up, the movement sharp and decisive. The time for gathering evidence was over. The stage was set, the witnesses were being summoned, and Beatrice Sterling had no idea that the garbage she had thrown to the curb was about to burn her entire world to the ground. Elena looked at Clara, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, a smile that didn't reach her cold, focused eyes. "Get some rest, Clara. Tomorrow, we go to a meeting." The following morning, the Sterling Manor was a cathedral of manufactured perfection, smelling of funeral lilies and expensive floor wax. Beatrice Sterling stood in the center of the grand foyer, her sharp voice cutting through the air like a blade as she directed a team of terrified florists. She wore a silk robe the color of bruised plums, her eyes scanning the room for the slightest deviation from her vision for the Legacy Gala. To her, every petal had to be a testament to her control, every shadow banished by the glare of crystal chandeliers. Elena Sterling stepped onto the landing of the mahogany staircase, her hand grazing the polished railing. She felt a strange, cold detachment as she watched the woman below. Yesterday's rage had crystallized into a quiet, vibrating clarity. She wasn't the trembling girl who had been cast out anymore. She was a strategist observing a failing empire. Beatrice looked up, her lips curling in an immediate, instinctive sneer. "You're up late. I've already told the staff to clear the breakfast service. If you're hungry, find a crust of bread in the kitchen. Just stay out of the foyer. I won't have you cluttering the aesthetic while the photographers are here." Elena didn't flinch. She descended the stairs with a slow, rhythmic grace that drew the eyes of two nearby decorators. "The aesthetic is already quite cluttered, Beatrice," she said, her voice echoing with a calm that seemed to unsettle the air. "Mostly with things that don't actually belong to you." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh, snapping her fingers at a florist who had placed a vase an inch too far to the left. "Still clinging to that tired old tune. It's pathetic, really. You've always had a flair for the dramatic, but you lack the breeding to back it up. You're a guest here by technicality and Julian's misplaced guilt. Don't mistake my tolerance for weakness." "I would never mistake you for being weak," Elena replied, stopping just a few feet from her. She leaned in slightly, the scent of Beatrice's heavy, cloying perfume hitting her like a physical weight. "But even the strongest foundations can be undermined by what's buried beneath them. You should check the locks on the archive room. Sometimes secrets have a way of walking out when they're no longer wanted." Beatrice's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something not quite fear, but a sharp, jagged annoyance crossing her face. She stepped closer, invading Elena's personal space, her breath smelling of bitter espresso. Locks are for people who have something worth stealing. You have nothing, Elena. You are nothing. Tomorrow night, when I stand on that stage and announce the expansion of the Sterling legacy, you'll be nothing more than a footnote I've finally erased. Across the room, Julian Sterling stood in the doorway of the library, his face pale as he watched the exchange. He held a crystal glass of water, his knuckles white against the glass. He had seen his mother's cruelty 1,000 times, but he had never seen Elena look at her with such icy, unwavering confidence. It was the look of a predator waiting for the trap to spring. He glanced toward the shadows of the hallway where Sela's thorn stood, the old man's face a mask of stony silence, his eyes fixed on Elena with a grim, knowing approval. "We'll see who history remembers," Elena said softly. She turned her back on Beatrice, a deliberate, stinging insult, and walked toward the gardens. By sunset, the manor had transformed into a fortress of high society. Clara Sterling found Elena in the small, overgrown corner of the estate where the shadows were longest. Clara held a stack of printed guest lists, her thumb tracing the name of a prominent investigative journalist she had slipped onto the final roster. "The board members are all confirmed," Clara whispered, her breath hitching with a mix of terror and excitement. "Even the ones Beatrice thinks are in her pocket. Sela's says the documents are secured in the safe house. There's no turning back now." Elena looked up at the darkened windows of the manor, where the lights were beginning to twinkle like cold stars. The weight of the silver recorder in her pocket felt like a heartbeat. 12 hours. The countdown was no longer in her head. It was in the very air she breathed. "I don't want to turn back, Clara," Elena said, her voice as steady as the rising tide. "I want to see the look on her face when she realizes she didn't just throw away the garbage. She threw away the only thing keeping her world from collapsing." She looked at the grand ballroom windows, where Beatrice's silhouette moved behind the glass, still perfecting a world that was already dead. The warning had been given. The arrogance had been confirmed. All that remained was the fall. The evening of the Sterling Legacy Gala arrived with a chilling precision. The manor transformed into a cathedral of glass and ego. Elena Sterling stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her fingers grazing the cool, hidden weight of the digital recorder tucked into the lining of her clutch. The air was thick with the cloying scent of white gardenias, Beatrice's favorite, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne. Below the soaring ceilings, the elite of the city moved like schools of predatory fish, their diamonds catching the light of the massive crystal chandeliers. Elena took a slow, steadying breath. She wasn't the trembling girl they had cast out months ago. She was the architect of the coming silence. "You're hovering, Elena. It's a common trait among those who don't quite know where they fit." The voice was like a blade wrapped in velvet. Elena didn't flinch as Beatrice Sterling glided into her personal space. The matriarch was draped in midnight blue silk that cost more than a modest home, her neck adorned with the sterling sapphires, stones that, according to the documents Sela's had recovered, had been purchased with embezzled pension funds. Beatrice didn't wait for a greeting. She signaled a passing waiter, taking a flute of crystal-clear bubbles without looking at the man. "I suppose I should thank you for showing up. It provides a certain, charitable aesthetic to the evening. The wayward daughter-in-law returns. It plays well for the cameras. I'm here to see the legacy you've built, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice a calm, low anchor against the older woman's sharp tide. "It's certainly illuminating." Beatrice let out a short, dry laugh, her eyes scanning the room for more important prey. "Don't try to be clever, dear. It doesn't suit your bone structure. Just try not to spill anything on that dress. I'd hate for Julian to have to pay for another round of your failed attempts at elegance." She leaned closer, the scent of her perfume suddenly suffocating. "Tonight, I am announcing the expansion of the Sterling Foundation. Your name will not be mentioned. Not in the speech, not in the brochures, and certainly not in the future of this family. You are a footnote that I am finally erasing." Beatrice patted Elena's cheek. a gesture so condescending it made the nearby guests whisper behind their hands, and swept away toward a group of city council members. Elena's pulse hammered against her throat, but she kept her expression unreadable. She caught sight of Julian Sterling across the room. Her husband looked striking in his tuxedo, but his shoulders were tight, his gaze darting toward his mother with a mixture of devotion and dread. He was the golden sun, polished to a high shine, yet hollowed out by the woman currently holding court at the center of the room. Clara Sterling appeared at Elena's side, her rebellious streak hidden under a sophisticated black gown, though her eyes burned with a familiar fire. "The dragon is in high spirits tonight," Clara whispered, taking a glass of water from a tray. "She just told the mayor that Julian is the sole visionary behind the new development project. She's completely erased your design work from the presentation." "Let her claim it," Elena replied, her gaze shifting to the far corner of the ballroom. Silas Thorne stood near the service entrance, dressed in a somber gray suit that allowed him to blend into the shadows of the pillars. He caught Elena's eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The final files had been uploaded. The visionary presentation Beatrice had prepared was no longer the only thing on the manor's secure server. "She thinks she's crowning him," Clara muttered, her grip tightening on her glass. "She doesn't realize she's just putting him on the chopping block next to her." "Julian has a choice to make tonight," Elena said. "I've given him the truth. If he chooses her lies when the lights go up, he goes down with the ship." The evening progressed with a sickeningly smooth rhythm. Beatrice was a master of the face slap in social form, moving through the crowd and subtly belittling anyone she deemed beneath the Sterling stature. Elena watched as Beatrice publicly corrected a junior architect's pronunciation, then turned to a group of investors to mock the quaint ideas of the firm they had recently acquired. The tension in the room was a physical weight, a coiled spring waiting for the moment of release. Every time Beatrice laughed, it felt like a fresh insult to the years Elena had spent trying to earn a place in a house built on sand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's voice rang out, amplified by the house sound system. He stood on the small dais at the front of the room, looking every bit the heir apparent. "If I could have your attention, my mother, Beatrice Sterling, would like to share the future of the Sterling legacy." The room fell into a practiced silence. The sound of shifting silk and the distant clink of a spoon against china were the only interruptions. Beatrice stepped onto the dais, the spotlight catching the cold glint of her sapphires. She looked invincible, a queen standing atop a mountain of secrets. Elena felt the weight of the recorder in her clutch one last time. She looked at Clara, then at Silas, who was now positioned near the tech booth. The dramatic irony of the moment tasted like copper in her mouth. Beatrice was about to give the performance of her life, unaware that the script had been rewritten. "Tonight," Beatrice began, her voice projecting with practiced authority, "we celebrate not just where we have been, but the purity of the Sterling name. We celebrate a legacy that cannot be tarnished by outsiders or weakened by those who do not understand the cost of greatness." She turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto Elena's for a fraction of a second. A smirk, cruel and triumphant, curled her lips. "I have a presentation that will show you exactly what the Sterling name stands for," Beatrice announced, gesturing toward the massive projection screen descending behind her. "Julian, if you would do the honors." Julian reached for the control tablet on the lectern. His hand hesitated for a heartbeat, his eyes finding Elena's in the crowd. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. "The truth," Elena whispered to herself, "is about to have its say." Julian's finger tapped the screen. The projectors hummed to life, casting a bright, blinding white light across Beatrice's confident silhouette. The room held its breath, and Elena felt the world tilt as the first image flickered onto the screen, not the architectural renderings of a new empire, but the first page of a forensic audit labeled unauthorized transfers. Beatrice began to speak, her first word of triumph already forming, just as the first gasp rippled through the audience. Beatrice Sterling froze. The microphone in her hand let out a sharp, piercing squeal of feedback as she lowered it, her knuckles turning a ghostly, bloodless white. On the massive screen behind her, the architectural renderings of a new Sterling empire had vanished, replaced by the cold, jagged lines of a forensic audit. Row after row of crimson text highlighted unauthorized transfers to offshore accounts, millions of dollars siphoned from the family trust into a private shell company. Beatrice's face didn't just pale, it seemed to physically cave in. The practiced mask of regal confidence shattered, leaving behind a frantic, hollow-eyed stranger. Her jaw went slack, her mouth working soundlessly like a fish gasping for air. A frantic twitch started in her left eyelid, and the vibrant color of her expensive rouge now looked like garish war paint against her graying skin. She looked smaller, suddenly, her shoulders hunching as if she could hide from the blinding light of the projector that was currently broadcasting her thievery to every power player in the city. Her breathing became a series of ragged, audible hitches that echoed through the sudden, graveyard silence of the ballroom. The silence was a physical weight, heavier than the crystal chandeliers overhead. Sila's Thorn stood at the edge of the room, his weathered face set in a grim mask of vindication as he clutched a ledger that matched the numbers on the screen. Clara Sterling didn't look away. She watched her mother with a searing, unflinching clarity, her hand gripped tightly in Elena's. Across the front row, the city's most influential investors leaned back, their physical withdrawal from the stage as synchronized as a choreographed dance. One woman gasped, her hand flying to her throat to clutch a string of pearls that suddenly felt like a noose. A prominent banker, who had been laughing with Beatrice only minutes prior, began whispering urgently into his phone, his face a mask of professional panic. The social fabric of the Sterling name was tearing apart in real time, the sound of it almost audible over the hum of the cooling fans. "There must be a mistake," Beatrice finally managed to croak, her voice a thin, reedy shadow of its former self. She turned toward her son, her eyes wide and pleading, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. "Julian, tell them, this is a fabrication, a hack." Julian Sterling didn't move toward her. He stood by the lectern, his shadow cast long and dark across the evidence of his mother's crimes. "I did the audit myself," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth she had manipulated for decades. He looked at the screen, then back at her, his expression one of profound, quiet grief. "Every signature is yours. Every transfer was authorized by your private key. You didn't just steal from the company, Mother. You stole from us." Elena Sterling stepped forward into the light. She felt the cool, hard edges of a secondary flash drive in her palm, the documents that proved the secondary layer of the fraud. She didn't need to raise her voice. The room was so quiet she could hear the clink of a falling spoon 3 tables away. The scent of the expensive lilies decorating the stage had turned cloying, smelling more like a funeral than a celebration. "You told me I was a temporary stain on a permanent legacy," Elena said, her voice steady and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. She met the frantic gaze of the woman who had tried to destroy her marriage and her reputation. "But it turns out the legacy was the lie, and you were the one holding the pen. I'm not the outsider anymore, Beatrice. I'm the one who just foreclosed on your house." Beatrice lunged toward the lectern, a desperate, clawing motion, but she tripped on the hem of her designer gown. She collapsed to her knees in the center of the stage, the light of the audit glowing across her back like a brand. Elena didn't wait for the security guards, led by a grim-faced Detective Miller, to reach the stage. She didn't wait to hear the hysterical excuses or the inevitable sobbing that was already starting to fill the room. She turned her back on the wreckage of the Sterling name and walked toward the grand mahogany doors. Her heels clicked a rhythmic, final beat against the marble, a sound of liberation that drowned out the whispers of the dying empire behind her. Elena pushed through the doors and into the cool night air, leaving the woman on the stage to face the audience she had spent a lifetime trying to impress. The night air was sharp, smelling of damp pavement and the fading scent of expensive floral arrangements. Elena Sterling stood by the edge of the circular driveway, her heels clicking softly against the asphalt as she walked away from the grand mahogany doors. Behind her, the gala was no longer a celebration. It was a crime scene in evening wear. 5 minutes had passed since she had delivered the final blow inside the ballroom, and the silence of the night was already being punctured by the rhythmic, approaching wail of sirens. She didn't turn around when the doors burst open again. She didn't need to. The sound of a woman's hysterical, jagged breathing told her exactly who had been escorted out. "You think you've won?" Beatrice's voice was a ragged shadow of its usual melodic silk. "You've stolen a house, Elena. You've played a little trick with the bank. But I am a Sterling. I will have you erased for this." Elena turned slowly. The woman being held by the arms by two of Detective Miller's subordinates was unrecognizable. Beatrice Sterling's face was a ruin of its former curated perfection. The heavy foundation had cracked in the heat of her panic, settling into deep, jagged lines around her mouth that made her look decades older. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were now bloodshot and bulging, darting wildly like a trapped animal. Her lower lip trembled uncontrollably, slick with a smear of designer lipstick that had bled into the fine wrinkles of her skin. The regal composure she had worn like armor for 40 years hadn't just slipped. It had disintegrated, leaving behind a gray, hollow mask of raw terror. "You aren't a Sterling anymore, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice dropping to a calm, lethal whisper. "You're just a defendant." Detective Miller stepped into the light of the street lamps, his face grim as he held up a clear evidence bag. Inside sat the original ledger Sela's Thorne had kept hidden for 20 years, the one that proved Beatrice had been siphoning the family trust into offshore accounts since the day Julian's father died. "The foreclosure was just the beginning, Mrs. Sterling," the detective said. "We have the wire transfer records. You're being charged with grand larceny and systemic embezzlement." Beatrice lunged toward Julian, who was standing near the fountain, his face pale in the moonlight. "Julian, tell them she's lying. Call the firm. Call the governor. Fix this." The silence that followed was heavier than the humid night air. Julian didn't move. He didn't even look at her. He looked at Elena, his eyes filled with a devastating clarity. "I already called the firm, Mother," he said, his voice flat. "I told them to cooperate fully with the audit. I'm not fixing anything for you ever again." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the loudest thing in the driveway. It was a metallic, final sound that seemed to echo off the stone walls of the estate. "Julian." Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, ugly sound. "I did it for you. I built this empire for you." "You built it on a graveyard of lies," Clara Sterling said, stepping out from behind her brother. She looked at her mother with a coldness that mirrored Elena's. "And you used Elena as the shovel. You're not a victim, Mom. You're just the only person left in this family who doesn't know how to tell the truth." Sela's Thorne emerged from the shadows of the portico, his weathered hands tucked into his pockets. He watched as the officers began to guide Beatrice toward the waiting cruiser. He didn't say a word, but the slight nod he gave Elena was the only validation she had ever truly wanted. Beatrice struggled, her designer heels skidding on the gravel. "Elena, wait. We can talk about this. I'll give you whatever you want. The jewelry, the gallery, just tell them it was a misunderstanding." Elena stepped closer until she could smell the cloying, expensive perfume that still clung to Beatrice's skin. It was the smell of a world that was currently collapsing. "I don't want your jewelry, Beatrice, and I certainly don't want your gallery." She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a single, heavy brass key. She held it up, letting it catch the blue and red flashes of the police lights. "I already have the house," Elena said. "And as for those offshore accounts you were counting on for your legal defense, I suggested the bank freeze them 2 hours ago. You're broke, Beatrice. You're going to have to rely on a public defender." The last bit of color drained from Beatrice's face. She looked at the key, then at her children, and finally at the crowd of socialites who had gathered on the steps to watch her fall. The people she had spent decades trying to impress were now holding up their phones, recording her humiliation for the world to see. "You're a monster," Beatrice hissed, her voice barely a whisper now. "No," Elena replied, turning her back one last time. "I'm just the architect who finally fixed the foundation." She walked toward her car, the sound of Beatrice's frantic pleas fading behind her. She didn't look back as the cruiser doors slammed shut. She didn't look back as the sirens began to pull away, taking the old regime with them. Elena sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel, her hands finally beginning to shake. It wasn't from fear. It was from the sudden, overwhelming weight of being free. She put the car in gear and drove toward the gates. She had a long night ahead of her, and for the first time in years, she knew exactly where she was going. She didn't need the Sterling name to get there. 6 months had passed since the night the Sterling legacy fractured under the weight of its own lies. Elena Sterling stood in the center of her new studio, a converted warehouse with soaring ceilings and windows that looked out over the river rather than the iron-wrought gates of the family estate. The air here smelled of fresh cedar and drying ink, a sharp, clean contrast to the cloying scent of lilies that had once haunted her every breath. The light was honest in this space. It didn't hide the dust or the hard work etched into the drafting tables. Clara Sterling walked in, carrying 2 cardboard cups of coffee. She looked different now. The rebellious edge of her youth had softened into a quiet, focused confidence. She set a cup down on the desk, her eyes drifting to the morning paper. On the 3rd page, a small headline detailed the final liquidation of the family holdings. "She's moving again," Clara said, her voice devoid of the old bitterness. "A smaller place this time, somewhere in the suburbs." Silas said she tried to take the silver tea service with her, but the auditors flagged it as a contested asset. Elena didn't need to ask who she was referring to. Beatrice Sterling had become a ghost that only appeared in legal briefs and whispered scandals. The woman who once ruled the city's social ladder from a throne of stolen blueprints was now living in a 2-bedroom rental with peeling wallpaper and a view of a parking lot. Her accounts were frozen. Her friends had vanished like mist, and the only person who visited her was a court-appointed lawyer who looked at his watch every 5 minutes. The wounded wolf had been declawed, left to howl in a concrete wilderness she had once looked down upon with pure contempt. "Does it make you feel better?" Clara asked, leaning against the desk and watching her sister-in-law. Elena took a sip of the bitter coffee, feeling the heat settle in her chest. "It doesn't feel like anything, Clara, and I think that's the point. The silence is the real victory." But the victory wasn't without its scars. The cost of the truth had been high, and the receipts were still being tallied. 2 weeks ago, she had met Julian Sterling in a sterile lawyer's office to finalize the dissolution of their marriage. He had looked older, the golden boy shimmer replaced by a weary, hollowed-out stare. They hadn't argued. There was nothing left to fight over. He couldn't forgive her for dismantling his mother's world, and she couldn't forgive him for being the blind spot that allowed the rot to grow in the first place. "I'm moving to London," he'd told her, his voice a ghost of the man she'd once loved. "I can't stay in a city where every building reminds me of what we lost. I need to be somewhere where the name doesn't mean anything." She had watched him walk away, knowing that while she had saved her soul, she had buried her heart in the process. The name was a curse they both had to shed, but he was doing it by running, while she was doing it by building something new from the rubble. The door chime echoed through the studio, and Silas Thorne stepped inside. He wasn't wearing the stiff, gray uniform of a servant anymore. He wore a simple wool coat and a smile that finally reached his eyes. He walked over to the main drafting table and laid down a weathered leather tube. "I thought you might want this for the new project," he said, his voice gravelly and warm. Elena slid the cap off and pulled out the contents. It was her father's original sketch for the library, the one Beatrice had tried to burn. It was singed at the edges, smelling faintly of smoke and old paper, but the lines were clear. They were bold, true, and mathematically perfect. "Detective Miller found it in a hidden floor safe during the final sweep of the estate," Silas explained. He thought it belonged with the person who actually understood the heart behind the architecture. Elena traced the ink lines with her thumb. The texture was rough, a physical reminder of the cost of the truth. She looked around her studio, at Clara, who was finally free to pursue her own path, at Sila's, who no longer had to carry the weight of other people's sins, and at the empty space on the wall where this sketch would finally hang. She had won. The foundation was fixed, the monster was gone, and the legacy was finally in the right hands. But as the sun began to set, casting long, lonely shadows across the polished floor, Elena realized that freedom was a heavy thing to carry. She had built a world where she finally belonged, but she had to learn how to live in it alone. She picked up her pen and turned back to the blueprints for the new community center. The ink flowed steady and dark. She didn't look back at the door. She didn't look back at the past. She just kept drawing, one line at a time, building a future that didn't need a famous name to stand tall.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.